Welcome to the 61st episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome back second-time guest, Rabbi David Fried.
Thank you. Great to be here again. Thanks for inviting me
Absolutely.
back.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So, for those less familiar with Rabbi Fried here, he teaches Judaics at the New England Jewish Academy in West Hartford, Connecticut. He's also an editor at the Lair House, and what brings him to fame is that we went to the same rabbinical school where he graduated in 2013. We missed each other. I graduated 4 years prior to him. We weren't there at the same time, were we?
We were not there at the same time, but your website with Rabbi Love Notes was very useful.
Awesome. I'm glad it was useful and it was still hanging around. So in addition to all of those things, he also, and this is for Jewish drinking folks, he also previously appeared on the Jewish Drinking Show for episode number 23 on how many cups of wine are to be drunk at the mourner's house in the Talmud. And actually through that episode, and this is what's germane to our present episode, which is that through that episode, I discovered Rabbi Fried's interest in medieval rabbinic authorities, which brings us to our topic for this episode, which is drinking on Purim, but more specifically, medieval rabbinic authorities on the parameters of drinking and getting drunk on Purim, right?
Yep.
Which is not as straightforward as one might expect. Then again, I don't really know what people expect as straightforwardness with this topic in particular, or really, let's be honest, any topic that comes up in the Talmud. It's not always exactly straightforward, and there's a lot of conversation and discussion, right?
Absolutely.
And I think, and by the way, I think that's helpful for even things that don't really get weirdly entangled with like touchy issues, like even just the most quotidian, just run-of-the-mill stuff. Even they generate a lot of debate and discussion. But for this topic, which is the topic of Purim, is not really a contentious one, but getting drunk is. I think drunkenness is anxiety provoking, especially in the medieval era.
I mean, not just anxiety provoking. Like, we have one source that butts up against like everything else the Talmud says about drunkenness, and I think it's that internal contradiction that is motivating a lot of the conversations in the Rishonim.
What do you mean? What does it have to say about drunkenness?
Meaning, drunkenness is generally criticized. It's something that detracts from Talmud Torah and detracts from your ability to relate to God. It leads people to do things that are chil Hashem. And there's a lot of, and I mean, some of the Rishonim say this explicitly. I mean, the Bach, he's not a Rishon, perhaps most explicitly, but the Bach is like, he is like, it can't be. How can the Gemara be asking us to do something that it criticizes in so many other places?
Okay, so I think it's not so clear. Let me put it that way.
Right. I mean, okay, this is your field of expertise, not mine. It's
right, because so the truth is, and we're going to go off on a tangent, but that's what podcasts are for. So we have in early Tannaitic, in early rabbinic texts, we have in the Mishnah, we have a drunken friend pushing someone in the water. It's just that happens. Like, we've all been there. We also have Mishnah Nazir, a woman who was drunk. She said, "Oh, I'm going to be a Nazaretess," whatever. It's just like, it's happening. Like, people are happening. Erevin, someone gets exempt from prayer if they happen to be drunk. We discussed this one, of course. Ketubot B was episode 23, which I previously had you on. The rabbis were concerned about mandating drunkenness at a mourner's house. Yom 49a, we also have drunk priest is a problem. Okay, that is an issue, a drunk priest, but priest shouldn't be when serving drunk. We do have women getting drunk in Ketubot 65a. That's a bit of an issue. We have some Tosefta stuff in the service of the temple. We have Rabbi Gamliel, who finds you can't really provide guidance, and there's some other stuff. Ultimately, these things are not necessarily negatively referred to, right? It's part of life. It's part of life.
Right. It's interesting. You're looking just at the Tannaitic sources, and I think most of the Gemaras that the Bach quotes against this, it's all from the Stama of the Bavli. So that would be an interesting conversation, right? Is there a change in attitude to drunkenness from the Tannaitic times to the Stama of the Bavli?
Yes, that is an interesting future discussion. I definitely, and by the way, what I showed everybody was a sort of a sneak peek at some future episode to be decided to be recorded on early rabbinic approaches to drunkenness. And then of course we can get to Amoraic less early, and then ultimately later on in the Talmud, which I think would be an interesting conversation about approaches to drunkenness. And I say this because I think it provides a great context to our present conversation, which is what are at least the attitudes in rabbinic literature towards getting drunk, which is, it's not the greatest thing, but it happens. It's certainly in those texts, it's not negatively looked upon, except with regards to maybe licentious behavior on the behalf of women, because that results in sexual issues. Also, priests serving in the temple, they can't be drunk when they're providing service.
That's an explicit pasuk. I mean, that's
right. So that's explicitly in the Torah that priests cannot be drunken while providing service. But aside from that, but here in these rabbinic texts, at least in the Tannaitic, the early rabbinic literature, it's not seen as negatively negative morality or like, right? There's not.
I wonder also, like,
to it.
Get into some of this later, like, what was their sheer of drunkenness when they use the word shikor? Like, how drunk are they talking?
Drunk? Look, they only really talk about being buzzed, shatui. They talk about shikor, which is drunk. And that one, Rebbe Chanina, which is an early Amora, talks about shikruto shel lo, of really not knowing what's going on in the world, of Lod's drunkenness from Genesis 19. But we have still, it's not overwhelmingly just providing it totally with a negative moral valence. It happens. And with Amoraim, it's a little less clear. It gets a little fuzzy as to which is a totally separate topic, totally separate conversation. Interestingly, this was all set off. I'm just going to provide a background for folks here. For our conversation's sake, I think in present day, although we're going to get away from present day really quickly, but present day, when I think people think about Purim, they think, oh, well, that's the drinkingest day on the Jewish calendar. So obviously there's a lot to be said about getting drunk in Purim, and yet it's not so clear. And really, one of the funny things I think is a great trivia question. Drinking is not even mentioned in Mishnah Megillah. It's not even there at all. It's not even really mentioned as part of the day. And it really is during this 4th century of the Common Era in Sasanian Persia where it really arises, especially.
It's mentioned in Megillah Esther itself, Yemei Mishteh v'Simcha.
So that's really funny. It 100%, actually it's 110% true. So I think Mishteh is used like 8 or 9 different times. And of course, it ends off, as you mentioned, towards, I think it's 9th or 10th chapter of Megillah Esther, where it's instituted that they are Yimei Mishteh, they're celebratory days, but specifically Mishteh, that drinking is an important part of it. And it's also hard to go through the entirety of Megillah Esther, keep reading about all these wine parties and drinking and and not having somewhere subconsciously planted in one's mind that Purim is going to involve drinking on some level. I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far. This is actually the 3rd out of 3 episodes this year on Purim. I hope you check out the previous 2 episodes on the drinking parties in the book of Esther, as well as a Kabbalistic approach to Purim drinking. Now back to this show. So we have Mishteh, it's throughout, right? And I think ultimately I really do think that on some level, even though none of the early rabbinic literature mentions this requirement or necessity of drinking on Purim, Rava is inspired by reading Megillah Esther, and he also is he's probably the biggest wine drinker, the biggest fan of wine in the Babylonian Talmud, which I
haven't actually looked up what does Rava have to say about wine elsewhere. Not something I've looked into.
That is an entirely separate topic, which I'm happy to. It's interesting. He takes, by the way, just as an example, he takes one particular verse from the book of Proverbs and uses about wine, and uses it 4 different ways, that not to look upon wine when it reddens. That verse.
Oh, is that the Gemara in our Psachim? I remember there's several
of them. There's several of them. Also, Rava also, by the way, he spends the entirety of Erev Pesach, the day leading up to Passover, drinking wine. That's his preparation for the Seder, is just drinking wine.
Oh yes, the whole debate of does wine make you more hungry or less hungry?
Right. So
It seems like
he's a
something
big wine proponent, which is really hilarious considering that his student Rav Papa was the big beer baron of the Bavli, and that results in an interesting exchange in Tractate Brachot, where they talk about, oh, you're a beer drinker, what do you do when it comes to wine situations? Anyways, we're getting off topic. The point is, what's really fascinating actually is that Rava is, and I think I mentioned this in the episode with Professor Rosenblum, is that Rava lives in Sasanian Persia, where beer is the drink of the land, yet as a major proponent of wine, he doesn't require or necessitate that the getting drunk on Purim should be done through wine, which I think is one of the most
right. It's unclear what the implication of levasume is, right? There certainly are poskim who assume that he means dafka wine, and then there are others who say no, levasume just means to be buzzed, to be intoxicated.
Which is really fascinating that it's not specified in the Talmud, right? That Rava almost goes out of his way to not specify it needs to be done with wine, almost like he has a sensitivity. He knows where he is. He's in a diaspora country that has beer as its primary beverage. And then I think, and I'm not trying to segue into our conversation, but it's going to happen, is that I'm just going to, here's the spoiler for everybody. I didn't see any Rishonim. I didn't see any of these early medieval authorities talking about specific beverages with which to get drunk. It seems to be following very much in line with Rava, who doesn't specify, really, right? None of the Rishonim, none of these early.
It really starts with, I think it's the Lavush, in the early Achronim, who really is the first one to say dafka wine,
right? Which is totally going to be.
Don't seem to specify.
I was going to say it's totally going to be a separate topic of conversation when we get to the Achronim, to the later authorities. But for now, just to focus on the Rishonim, they very much follow in line with Rava and what the Talmud has to say, in lack of specificity of beverages with which to get drunk on Purim, which is, I think, a fascinating topic, and I'm glad we've gotten it out of the way. All right, this all stems from really two quick texts on the Babylonian Talmud, Megillah 7b, Rava. So this is, if people are interested in a further deep dive into this, you can feel free to check out episode 20 with Professor Jordan Rosenblum, in which we talk about the Talmudic text and context of, there are two things juxtaposed. We have a story of Rabbi and Rabbi Zerah, two third generation Amoraim who get together one Purim, get drunk, one of them kills the other, and then the next day he revives his friend, and then one of those rabbi students, Rava, in the subsequent generation, then declares there's an obligation for people to get drunk on Purim until they can no longer discern between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. So
right, of course, you just presented it in chronological order.
So I presented in the temporal or the chronological order. However, and this is where it gets really fascinating, is the literary order is reversed, which is not typical for the Babylonian Talmud to do that. And another point. So I think a big question that comes up.
Challenge that assertion that's not typical.
It happens. I didn't say it never happens.
Right. I mean, it's usually in chronological order, but I think one of the key exceptions is we usually put halachic statements prior to agadic statements.
So then when we come to this, which is why is it arranged this way? And I think a big question is this arranged this way either as an illustrative move, right? That this story illustrates like the extent to which one takes Rava's statement seriously, right? One might say, oh yeah, you just get drunk. And it shows actually his teacher and his teacher's colleague got super duper drunk, right? Or do you take it as a cautionary tale, that this is really actually limiting the seriousness with which we should take Rava's requirement?
I would say that all of the Rishonim take it as a cautionary tale, even the ones who think we poskin like Rava in the end. I think
really
either a cautionary tale in the sense of the Gemara is rejecting Rava and saying, no, we don't poskin like Rava because look what happened if you do like Rava, or it's a cautionary tale just in the sense of personal musar of yes, Rava's right, we poskin like Rava, but be careful you don't get yourself that far.
Interesting. I mean, not all of them necessarily go in that direction. You know what? let's just roll into it, okay? So I think this is a good intro to all this, which is okay. I mean, I think it's fair to say the medieval rabbinic authorities had a deep anxiety about this. How seriously do we take this? Okay, so let me just say there are some medieval authorities, some Rishonim that take Rava very seriously and go totally on board with it. Right? We have perhaps one of the most famous Rishonim of all time. I should say one of the most famous Rishonim, but perhaps one of the most famous rabbis of all time is Rambam, Maimonides, who in the 12th century said, you get drunk until you drink wine, you get drunk, and then you have a deep sleep off of that drunkenness.
Yeah, I mean the Ramah, not the Ramah,
no.
Rambam.
Oh yeah.
Say, yeah, the Rambam sounds like he has the most literal read of Rava. Or I got confused with the Ramah because the Ramah seems to understand the Rambam differently, which I think is not the pshat of what the Rambam is saying. But yeah, the Rambam has seemingly the most literal read of Rava in terms of how he paskins, right? And then
the Torah.
Right, the Torah.
Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher in the 14th century.
He doesn't really give us his interpretation. He just quotes Rava almost verbatim. He translates the Aramaic into Hebrew, but other than that, but yeah, I mean, in terms of who definitely paskins Rava lahalacha in some version, you have the Rambam, you have the Torah, who's quoting his father, the Rosh, and the Rif also. So all of the Beis Yosef's big three seem to paskin like Rava, the Rambam, the Rosh, the Rif, and yet, and I think this is really interesting.
You mentioned Beit Yosef, written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who also wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and he quotes Rava directly, verbatim.
Yes, so here's what's really interesting. Mm-hmm. The Beis Yosef's big three are the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh. All three of them paskin like Rava, which makes sense that therefore he paskins like Rava in Shulchan Aruch. In the Beis Yosef, he quotes none of them. In the Beis Yosef, he quotes only the Rishonim who paskin against Rava.
That's really interesting. So you're saying Rabbi Yosef Cairo in his Shulchan Aruch, he typically follows a few rabbis, rabbinic authorities, and yet he quotes zero of them in his commentary to Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher's Torah. And and for people who don't know, feel free to check out the Beit Yosef, which translates to Joseph's house. You're welcome to check out Joseph's house commentary on the Torah, in which he basically provides opposite, like really critical, basically delimiting opinions, which we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, we have this really basically this thrust from Rava to Rambam. You mentioned Rif, and I guess Rosh as well, and then through Torah and Shulchan Aruch, where it's just this straight line, this train of, yes, you get drunk on Purim, that's it. That is really fascinating. I didn't think about that because I was wondering, like, why is Rabbi Cairo not quoting Rambam here in Joseph's house? And so I was curious about that.
Oftentimes, the Rabbi Yosef Cairo is more deferential to the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, and the Beis Yosef than the Shulchan Aruch. It's a younger work. In the Shulchan Aruch, which he wrote when he was older, he's sometimes more willing to go out on a limb with his own opinion. But here, it's interesting. It's the opposite. That again, he quotes none of his big three in the Beit Yosef. Mm-hmm. And in Shulchan Aruch, he just goes and paskins like them.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. There is one other. Do you know who this Mahariv is?
I have no idea.
Okay, so Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who is a contemporary of Rabbi Cairo, quotes in Darchei Moshe, and his Moses Ways commentary to Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher's Torah, is that you get drunk and you sleep and you are unable to discern between Haman's cursedness and Mordechai's blessedness. Now, that does seem to be also in line with this. You get drunk and eventually you sleep.
Right. So it's interesting he uses, the Mahariv uses the word yishtaker, right, to get drunk. So
totally unqualified.
Right. But the Ramah equates his position with that of the Rambam. It's a little bit different, right? The Mahariv says yishtaker v'yishan. You get drunk and then you go to sleep. The Rambam says yishtaker ad sheyeradim b'shichruto, which sounds like until you pass out from your drunkenness, which is a little bit more than get drunk and go to sleep.
And it's a solid sleep, because tardema versus sheina
Yeah.
is a much more intense sleep, right?
But then it's interesting what the Ramah in his comments on Shulchan Aruch seems to interpret.
Wait. Let's hold off on that.
Yet. Hold off.
Spoiler. It's a good tease for later for people to stay on for the rest of the episode. I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far. I mentioned earlier on in this episode, this is the third of a 3-part series this year on Purim. But guess what? Passover is just around the corner. So starting next week, we're going to start a series on Passover. Here's a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi David Polsky. I'm not really clear why this tradition would have been passed on of not requiring reclining for the wine.
I agree with you. You would think of all the things you would recline for. I mean, especially if you have that historical source of the symposium where the whole idea is that they're reclining and drinking wine. So yeah, so you're right.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this week's episode. Those are the main Rishonim that talk about just going on board with Rava's statement, right? Unqualified. Yeah. Cool. All right. So there is definitely a stream of thought in the Rishonim, in these early medievalists. You get drunk. You follow what Rava said, and you get drunk. Okay. However, this is where we get a little complicated. It doesn't always stay that way.
I think it gets started with Rabbeinu Ephraim. He's the one that everyone else is quoting. Rabbeinu Ephraim says the way we should interpret the Gemara placing that story about Rabba and Rabbi Zera and their misadventures with drinking after Rava's statement is to reject Rava, is to say, look what happens if you follow Rava. We don't paskin like Rava.
Right. And for those less familiar, this is Rabbi Ephraim ben Isaac of Regensburg, a 12th century rabbi, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, and then he's quoted by Rabbi Nissim of Gerona in the 14th century.
Right. So the Ran quotes him without comment, so seemingly adopting him lahalacha. Mm-hmm. So does the Baal Ma'or. So does the Meiri. Mm-hmm. The Beit Yosef seems to quote him, even though the Beit Yosef doesn't paskin that way in Shulchan Aruch, but the Beit Yosef in the Beit Yosef seems to quote him without comment, seems to adopt that opinion. He juxtaposes him with the Orchot Chaim, who you are going to tell me what his name is. I don't remember.
Rabbi Aaron ben Yaakov HaKohen.
Yeah, so he juxtaposes
in the 14th century
with the Orchot Chaim, who, it's not entirely clear that the Orchot Chaim is on the same page as him. The Orchot Chaim does not quote him. The Ramah seems to have a different interpretation of the Orchot Chaim, as we'll get to later, but the Beit Yosef, by juxtaposing Rabbeinu Ephraim with the Orchot Chaim, seems to think they're on the same page, that the Orchot Chaim is saying, no, don't get drunk. We reject Rava. You have tzat yoter milimudo. There's still yemei mishta, as the Megillah says. You should have a little bit of wine, perhaps a little bit more wine than you normally have, but no drunkenness.
Right. So it's an interesting move by Rabbi Ephraim ben Yitzchak of Regensburg to say this story isn't simply is instead of being an exemplar, it's actually the cautionary tale, and not just a cautionary tale. It actually drives actually against it, right? And that one shouldn't actually take Rava seriously, and then ultimately resulting in Rabbi Ephraim ben Yitzchak's suggestion, well, just drink a little bit more than you're used to, and you can accomplish, right.
Right, and it's interesting, right? The first time I learned this sugya, I remembered somehow Rabbeinu Ephraim being just like a das yachid in the sugya. But, going through it again now, there really are a lot of Rishonim who do quote him. I'd almost say it's like 50-50 whether they accept him or not.
Which sounds like he had a lot of popularity amongst these medieval authorities. These
right, and not to spoil your episode on more contemporary poskim, but the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan both quote Rabbeinu Ephraim halacha. Mm-hmm.
Which is a good trailer or tease for that ultimate episode. Ultimately, when that episode appears, So he really, I think a big part of the pull or what's really interesting about that is the literary aspect, and also the cautionary aspect, right? I think some of these rabbis are concerned what happens when people in mass are getting drunk. Maybe that's not a great move.
I think literarily, and I think Rabbeinu Ephraim is totally wrong.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. How so?
Have you read Robert Cover's Nomos and Narrative?
No, but I'm going to trust your read of it.
So I think this is a great example of, it's been a long time since I've read it, so I hope I'm doing it justice. Law is always situated within a narrative context.
Mm-hmm.
When you write a statute, when you codify a law, you can only codify one of many competing values, but the narrative context will push back on some of those other values in ways that help you interpret what the law is. And I think he doesn't bring this example, although he does bring a lot of Talmudic examples, which is interesting. But sometimes the Gemara will look at a story, a Maisa and a Mishnah, and ask, Maisa listor, right? Is the story being brought to contradict the halacha? And I think his insight is that it's always Maisa listor. Stories are always brought in legal discussions to push back in opposite directions, but not to negate the law. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what's going on here as well. We have one value, which is about drinking on Purim, and then we have a story not to negate the law, but to push back in the opposite direction and say, but remember, there are other competing values here as well. Mm-hmm. Take those in mind when interpreting the law, but that doesn't mean we reject the law.
That's great. So that's really fascinating. And Rabbi Fried, that kind of reminds me of another Rishon, Rabbi Aaron ben Yaakov HaKohen, that drunkenness leads to the worst sins, right? It sounds like it's not exactly as you say. It's an incident that goes against it, a maaseh listor, but that it sort of bounds to some extent, or at least provides on the horizon moral concerns, right?
Right, and I think that's when we get into the discussion of like what's the shear of adla yada, I think what's pushing a lot of the Rishonim to say, to say it's something other than, total complete drunkenness, is also this sort of this interplay with the story, not to the extent of Rabbeinu Ephraim is to say we reject it, but as values that need to be taken into account in interpreting what could Rava have meant.
Interesting. Yeah. It's a really fascinating qualification that Rava includes in his statement of drunkenness all the way to not knowing how to differentiate between the cursedness.
Right. I mean, you mentioned like Shechruto Shalot earlier, right? The Bach, who's again not a Rishon, but he's on the page of the Torah.
For those less familiar, Rabbi Yoel Circus.
It can't be that it means that you literally don't know good from bad. That's Mamish Shechruto Shalot. Nobody would condone that.
Right. So what Rabbi Aaron ben Yaakov HaKohen in the 14th century writes is that, you got to get drunk, but maybe it's not a full drunkenness. Maybe. Oh, I'm sorry. No. The drunkenness is actually is totally forbidden. It's an Isser Gamor, and actually there's no transgression greater than this because it causes sexual immorality and it causes bloodshed, and not only that, those aren't the exclusive transgressions which can happen. So he ultimately also does, similarly as Rabbi Ephraim ben Yitzchak of Regensburg, that says just drink a little bit more than you're used to drinking. Maybe get buzzed, but don't get out of control. Right? He really ratchets it up. Like the rhetoric is really intense. You get the worst sins that is possibly, and obviously other sins that can easily come along as well. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So this language of transgression, obviously referring back to both Genesis 9 and 19 with Noah and his son, the drunkenness of Noah, Lot and his daughters, as well as even this story here on Megillah 7b with Rabba and Rabbi Zera, there's murder happening. And so it's easy for other sins, much lesser sins or transgressions to occur through drunkenness. You mentioned Tosfot mentions on the page that there's this like a song with particular lyrics that
right. Adla Yada means when you start to mess up the lyrics of the song. It doesn't really mean you don't know good from evil. You don't know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy in the story. It means when this song, which mentions Arar Haman and Baruch Mordechai, when you're at the point of drunkenness, where you start like slurring your words a little, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So Rabbi Yaakov ben Moshe Levi Moelin in the early 15th century says you can't properly sing this song. It's quoted in Moses' Ways by Rabbi Isserlis. And also, it seems to be that Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel,
the Rosh, again, all
in the
all
early
these people
14th,
are just
in the early 14th
Joseph seems to
century,
be the one who really develops this approach.
right? It's about this liturgical. I don't know if it's a liturgical passage, but it's whatever this song is. If you start slurring or messing up the words, then which is clearly a lower barrier than having some sort of moral decision making, right?
Right. And then, the other one, the Darkei Moshe also quotes the Rabbeinu Yerucham from the Toldos Adam V'Chava, who thinks it's about the ability to do arithmetic. Right? Because he notes that Arar Haman and Baruch Mordechai are the same thing in gematria.
Uh-huh.
And if you're at the point of intoxication where you wouldn't be able to add up those gematrias in your head, that's Adila Yada.
Mm-hmm. And for those keeping score at home, that is Rabbi Yerucham ben Meshulam, an early 14th century rabbi. Right. So, this mathematic thing, which really is a different, it's funny, but I guess it has a sense of keeping things in order like a song. Right.
It's trying to say we paskin like Rava, but let's find some standard that is less than Shechruto Shalot that Rava could have been referring to.
Yeah. And we also have, it's interesting how closely does Rava need to be followed. And we have also Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi of Bonn in the late 12th century, the Raviyah, who says, well, yeah, it's like a commandment, but it's not really obligatory. It's a mitzvah. It's good to do, but there's no obligation. Like if you haven't gotten drunk on Purim, you haven't nullified the opportunity for this mitzvah, for this obligation. He makes it sound like it's a good thing to do. It's not an obligation. Don't feel you missed out totally. That's an interesting move by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi of saying, well, how much of an obligation really is it? And I think it's a nice way to tie this all up, which is seeing under how seriously do these Rishonim, these medieval authorities, take Rabbah's requirement, his statement, how seriously do they take it? Is it an absolute fundamental obligation of one's Purim experience? This is how Purim needs to be experienced, through drunkenness, or is it an optimal performance of Purim? And if you don't, you don't. It's not as obligatory as the stuff mentioned in Mishnah Megillah, right? Mishloach Manot, Mikra Megillah. These things, right? These are the fundamental aspects, practices of Purim. Getting drunk, it's nice, but not a requirement, right? And I think a lot of these Rishonim, a lot of these medieval authorities they're bouncing between Rava's statement and the story, and there's a lot of anxiety there.
Yeah,
right. So ultimately, we get to I think this pulls us into where I'm just going to a coda of sorts, where we get to the Shulchan Aruch, which the set table, the arranged table by Rabbi Yosef Karo with glosses by Rabbi Moshe Isserlis from Poland. And we mentioned this earlier, but Rabbi Karo straight out quotes Rava, unqualifiedly.
We don't know. Since he straight out quotes Rava, we don't know which version of Rava. We don't know, is it the Rambam's version of Rava? Is it Tosfos' version of Rava? Is it Rabbi Yerucham's version of Rava?
What do you mean?
We don't know which. What?
Oh, we don't know through which lens to understand it, but it seems to be that you're right, which is an interesting non-qualification that he just straight up quotes it almost, and clearly, as you pointed out through his Joseph's House commentary to Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher's tour, is that he knows of the sort of the counter text, as it were, amongst the Rishonim. So he's keenly aware of the concerns, and yet directly quotes Rava.
So the Ramah, as we said, right, he quotes this guy, the Mahariv, and he quotes the Rambam, who are saying similar things, who both use that word yishtaker, get drunk, and then something about go to sleep. And the Ramah clearly in the Darkei Moshe understood them to be on the same page, and that's who he seems to paskin like, except with a much, much toned down version of it. He Dafka takes out the word yishtaker. He specifically says lo yishtaker, right?
So if I may, the wording. So Rabbi Isserlis here, he's from Krakow. He says one actually doesn't need to get altogether that drunk. In fact, one simply drinks more than one's typically used to, and then they sleep. and not the strong sleeping language of Rambam of a deep sleep, just simply sleeping.
Right, which is the Mahariv's language of Yishan.
Right.
But he takes the word Yishtaker out of the Mahariv, and instead he plugs in the Orchos Chaim's language of Tzat Yoter Milimudo.
Right, and then on top of that, saying, well, then through this sleeping, you're not cognizant of the differentiation.
Right. So I mean, unlike the Beit Yosef, who seemed to understand the Orchos Chaim is basically on the same page as Rabbeinu Ephraim, that basically we don't paskin like Rava. The Ramah seems to understand that the Orchos Chaim, in fact, does paskin like Rava, that Adala Yada never meant drunkenness. Adala Yada means take a nap afterwards, and when you're asleep, you don't know these things.
Well, Rabbi Islis does say v'yesh omrim, so he's aware that obviously there's Rabbi Cairo's formulation of this, or presentation of Rava's formulation rather,
Sure.
And that this is an alternative view,
yeah,
and that you don't really need to get all together that drunk, which is pushing back. You have a sip of something.
Right. And usually we know when the Ramah quotes only one Yesh Omrim against Shulchan Aruch, it usually means he passes that way.
So clearly Rabbi Isserlis was going in that direction. I just want to say, for those out there, this is not the end of the conversation. As Rabbi Fried was quick to point out, there are definitely subsequent conversations and subsequent texts and subsequent commentary on, as I mentioned, as we finished up with this Shulchan Aruch, of the set table, the arranged table. There's many conversations afterwards in the post-16th century. And so that hopefully will be the topic of a future conversation about Purim drinking and the various, halachic parameters in conversation. Rabbi Fried, thank you so much for this conversation. I found it enlightening and helpful to think about how the post-Talmudic rabbis thought about this in the medieval era. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure to come talk about Torah, and I'd love to be back another time.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, and l'chaim.
I am.
L'chaim.